Babylon, 560 years before Christ. Beneath the relentless sun of Mesopotamia, the great city pulsed like the beating heart of the known world. Colossal walls rose above the dusty desert. Golden temples reflected light like divine mirrors. King Nebuchadnezzar II, sovereign of the greatest empire of his age, surveyed his capital from the heights of the royal palace. Everything was in its place. Everything obeyed his will. The most advanced engineering of antiquity bent before his throne. Astrologers read the night sky. Scribes pressed decrees into clay tablets, still soft and wet. The empire seemed eternal. But in a silent chamber of the palace, a woman wept in secret. Queen Amytis, daughter of the king of the Medes, wife of the most powerful sovereign on earth, was wasting away from longing. And her grief would move colossal stones, redirect the waters of the Euphrates, and alter the history of human architecture forever. Stones rising against gravity, fired bricks climbing impossible terraces, water-scaling walls where no water was ever meant to rise. Workers carrying whole palm trees on their shoulders, engineers shouting orders in the suffocating heat, 1,000 ropes pulled taut, wooden wheels turning against a blood-red sky, sweat running down calloused hands, and above it all, the sound of a city transforming the impossible into a living garden. When the last brick was set, and the last drop of water ran through hidden channels, all of Mesopotamia stopped to watch. Priests knelt on the stairways of the ziggurats. Merchants abandoned their goods in the bazaar stalls. Children pointed at the sky above Babylon, where trees now floated above the walls like a forest suspended in nothing. And for over 2,500 years since, humanity has tried to understand how it was possible. Babylon had not been born in that instant. It was an ancient city, founded on the banks of the Euphrates, in times lost even to Sumerian memory. Under the reign of Hammurabi, nearly 1,800 years before the birth of Christ, it was already a center of law, commerce, and devotion. But it would be under the Chaldean dynasty, in the era historians call the Neo-Babylonian period, that the city would reach its absolute apex. In the 7th century before Christ, Assyrian power had begun to crumble. The Medes, a warrior people from the Iranian plateau, allied themselves with the Chaldeans to destroy Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. In the year 612 before Christ, the ancient mistress of the world fell in fire and ash. From the Assyrian ruins, two empires emerged as heirs, Media to the north and east, and Chaldean Babylon to the south. The alliance between the two kingdoms was sealed in blood, gold, and marriage. Young Nebuchadnezzar, heir to the Chaldean throne, received as his wife the princess Amytis, daughter or granddaughter, depending on the source, of the Median king Cyaxares. It was a political marriage, calculated to guarantee peace between two colossi. But fate, as it always does, found unexpected paths. When Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne in the year 605 before Christ, he inherited a vast empire hungry for glory. He would defeat the Egyptians at Carchemish. He would subdue the Phoenicians. He would besiege Jerusalem twice, carrying the Jews into captivity, an episode that would echo through the sacred scriptures under the name of the Babylonian captivity. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, according to the biblical account, would walk the corridors of his palace. He was a man feared by nations and reverent before his gods. Babylon became his obsession. He rebuilt the temple of Marduk, the city's supreme deity. He raised again the ziggurat of Etemenanki, identified by many scholars with the Tower of Babel. He constructed the Ishtar Gate, sheathed in cobalt blue bricks with bulls and dragons in gilded relief. He paved the processional way with stones so brilliant they seemed to breathe their own light. Under his command, Babylon became the most spectacular city of antiquity. Its walls, according to the historian Herodotus, were so wide that 2 chariots could pass side by side along their top. Its gates were clad in bronze, its avenues perfumed with incense burning on stone altars, but at the heart of the palace, behind 1,000 linen curtains, a woman was consuming herself in silence. Amytis had grown up on the plateaus of Media, land of cool forests, crystalline streams, and mountains draped in eternal snow. She knew the scent of wild cedar. She remembered the first spring rains beating against the leaves of the oak trees. She could recall the shade of the valleys where shepherds guided their flocks. She carried in her memory the sound of bells hanging at the necks of goats, the singing of streams running between stones, the distant chorus of migratory birds crossing the sky at summer's end. When she was given to the Chaldean king, she crossed deserts and steppes until she arrived in Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, land of fired clay and bare horizons. Babylon was magnificent. But Babylon was flat. It was yellow dust. It was heat that cracked the skin. It was the absence of groves and the absence of mountains. To the eyes of a princess raised among the green heights of the Zagros, it was a prison of gold and brick. The servants said that the queen had nearly stopped speaking, that she stared at the horizon at dusk and wept, that she refused banquets, that she was losing weight. The court physicians searched the clay tablets for the cause of her affliction and found nothing. It was not a disease of the body, it was a disease of the soul. The priests offered sacrifices to Ishtar, goddess of love. The astrologers consulted the position of Venus in the night sky. The handmaidens brought soft music of harp and reed flute, hoping to return to the queen her lost joy. Nothing worked. The melancholy continued to corrode that soul, the way salt corrodes iron. Nebuchadnezzar, conqueror of nations, found himself facing an invisible enemy. He could not defeat longing with swords. He could not buy it off with tribute. He could not kill it by decree. Only one weapon remained to him, the absolute power to transform reality. If his beloved could not return to the mountains, then the mountains would come to her. The king summoned his kingdom's engineers. He called for the architects of the temple of Marduk. He sent for master builders from conquered lands, Phoenician sages, Egyptian geometers, Sumerian irrigation specialists. Before them, he issued an impossible challenge. They would build a garden, not just any garden, a garden that rose from the ground like a mountain, a garden with trees at the top and flowers in the middle, and fountains that sang from the heights. A garden that would show the queen she was still home, even surrounded by desert. The engineers fell silent. This violated everything known about construction. Water, by its very nature, flows downward, never up. Plants are heavy, roots corrode foundations, dry soil cracks, wet soil slips. To raise a living mountain in the middle of Mesopotamia was to ask the gods for a favor no mortal could deliver. But Nebuchadnezzar did not want reasons. He wanted results, and so began what was perhaps the greatest feat of botanical engineering in antiquity. First, a site was chosen, near the southern palace, along the banks of the Euphrates, where the river could supply the essential ingredient of the enterprise, water. The ground was cleared, leveled, examined. Ancient geologists probed the soil with rods and ropes. Astronomers consulted the stars to choose a favorable day. Priests poured libations of wine and oil over the ground, invoking the protection of the gods Marduk, Nabu, and Ishtar. Bulls were sacrificed at the altars. Clay tablets were buried in the foundations, inscribed with cuneiform prayers asking the gods to sustain what men were attempting to raise. Then came the bricks, millions of them, each one molded from river clay, dried in the sun, then fired in the city's kilns. The bricks of the base would be saturated with bitumen, a black, viscous substance that seeped naturally from the surrounding earth. The bitumen would serve as a waterproofing agent, preventing moisture from destroying the foundations. It was a technique ancient to the Mesopotamians, who had known the secret of the black oil long before the modern world discovered its value. The structure would be pyramidal, in superimposed terraces, each terrace supported by arches and massive pillars, each pillar reinforced by internal columns of stone brought from distant mountains, for Mesopotamia, a land of clay, was poor in solid rock. Entire caravans crossed the desert hauling limestone blocks on the backs of donkeys and oxen. Each block had to be hoisted by systems of pulleys and levers, each piece fitted with millimetric precision so that the structure, when bearing the weight of soil and water, would not collapse upon the very men building it. The projected height, according to later ancient accounts, reached approximately 25 meters, equivalent to a modern 8-story building. The base would occupy a square area of roughly 120 meters on each side. It was a colossal structure, comparable in ambition to the pyramids of Egypt, though intended not for the dead, but for a single living and melancholy woman. Over each terrace, a thick layer of interwoven reed was laid down with asphalt, then 2 layers of bricks sealed with gypsum, then sheets of lead. The lead was the secret. It formed a final barrier against water, preventing moisture from seeping into the lower floors. Without the lead, the entire garden would have collapsed into ruin within months, bringing down trees and workers in the same catastrophe. It was a brilliant solution, anticipating by centuries the techniques the Romans would employ in their aqueducts. Finally, over the metal sheets came the earth. Black earth, fertile, hauled from the rich fields of the north, from the banks of the Tigris, from the plains of Akkad. Earth enough to support not merely flowers and shrubs, but full-grown trees, pine trees, cedars, tamarisks, palms, fig trees, plum trees, pomegranates, date palms, species brought from every land the empire had conquered, a botanical inventory without precedent in history, cedars from Lebanon, cypresses from Syria, olive trees from the valleys near Damascus, roses brought from Persia, aromatic plants carried from the frontiers with Arabia, each species selected to withstand the Mesopotamian heat, but also to evoke, through fragrance and color, the mountainous lands of Media. But the central problem remained, the problem before which every engineer in the ancient world came to a standstill. The water. Mesopotamia had water. It had the Euphrates running alongside the city. It had the Tigris a few leagues away. It had artificial canals dug centuries before by the Sumerians. But all of that water ran at ground level, at the level of the fields, at the level of human feet. For the suspended garden to live, the water had to rise. It had to climb 25 meters. It had to reach the top. It had to bathe each terrace, nourish each root, feed each ornamental fountain. This is where the genius of the Chaldean engineers entered the story. Ancient sources mention a complex mechanical system, possibly based on principles that centuries later would be attributed to the Greek Archimedes. An internal screw rotating inside an inclined tube, capable of raising water in continuous motion. Other accounts describe hydraulic wheels with buckets, similar to the water wheels still seen in parts of the Middle East today. Still others speak of endless chains of buckets, pulled by slaves and oxen in perpetual rotation, day and night, without rest. Perhaps all of these systems were used together. Perhaps the secret of the Hanging Garden was precisely the ingenious combination of multiple techniques operating in synchrony. Pumps, channels, siphons, reservoirs hidden at the top of the structure, internal cisterns buried in the heart of the vegetative pyramid, every drop rising, every drop descending, every drop nourishing, every drop returning to the river that had offered it. The construction lasted years. Scribes recorded on clay tablets the consumption of bricks, the payment of workers, the transport of materials. Some of the laborers were free Babylonian citizens, paid in barley, oil, and silver. Others were captives from the wars. Jews torn from Jerusalem, Phoenicians from Syria, Egyptians taken in battle. The languages of the known world mingled on the worksite. Orders in Akkadian, songs in Hebrew, laments in Aramaic, prayers murmured in Phoenician. The Mesopotamian sun beat down on all of them without distinction. The dust entered their lungs. The bricks split their hands. The scaffolding collapsed and carried lives with it. Desert serpents climbed through the beams. Scorpions nested beneath the stones. Accidents claimed dozens, perhaps hundreds of men. Each life that was lost was buried on the banks of the river, without a name, without a stone, carried away by eternal waters that would run for millennia after every face was forgotten. And yet the structure grew, floor upon floor, terrace upon terrace, as though the earth itself were defying the sky in a slow procession of clay and sweat. Meanwhile, the queen remained in her palace, unaware of the work. Nebuchadnezzar had forbidden anyone from speaking to her about the project. He wanted it to be a surprise. He wanted the moment of revelation to be perfect. For years, she saw only distant shapes rising behind the inner walls of the palace. She heard only the muffled sound of hammering. She felt only the fine dust settling onto her silk tapestries. When she asked the servants, she received evasive answers. When she questioned the king, he smiled in silence. And then, on a day no tablet recorded with precision, but which the memory of the world has never forgotten, the moment arrived. The king took her by the hand. He led her through the corridors of the palace. He crossed marble courtyards. He passed through smaller gardens where perfumed roses announced what lay ahead. He climbed stairs of polished stone, and he stopped before a curtain of purple linen, embroidered with threads of gold. The curtain fell, and Amiti saw. Before her rose a mountain, but not just any mountain, a living mountain, green from top to base, terrace after terrace covered with leafy trees, palm trees swaying in the wind, cedars whispering secrets from above, rose bushes cascading down the walls in crimson clusters, fountains breaking from nowhere on the upper platforms, gentle waterfalls spilling from floor to floor, birds brought from conquered lands, singing in golden cages scattered through the gardens, butterflies, bees, the scent of jasmine, the scent of citrus, the scent of wet earth after rain, even in a place where rain almost never fell. It was Media. It was her home. It was her childhood. It was everything she had lost and believed lost forever. The queen fell to her knees and wept. But this time her tears were not tears of longing. They were tears of something for which human language has never invented a proper name. They were the recognition that in the cruel world of kings and empires, someone had heard her. Someone had understood. Someone had moved stones, rivers, and thousands of men simply so that she might see once more a green leaf trembling in the breeze. Nebuchadnezzar looked at her without speaking. He who commanded nations stood there in silence. It is said that he only whispered softly, "You are home." And the wind of Mesopotamia, for the first time, blew through a garden he had never imagined he could possess. The news spread through the city like fire through dry straw. Ambassadors from distant kingdoms traveled to see it with their own eyes. Merchants carried accounts along caravan routes all the way to India and Nubia. Priests proclaimed the miracle as proof of divine favor. Children climbed onto the roofs of their adobe homes to catch a glimpse of the treetops rising above the walls. At night, beneath the desert moonlight, the garden looked like a constellation descended to earth, suspended between sky and ground. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian who would live some 500 years later, would describe the wonder with admiration. Strabo, the geographer of the same period, would record its dimensions. Villot of Byzantium, compiling the 7 wonders of the ancient world, would include the Hanging Garden alongside the Great Pyramid of Egypt, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the lighthouse of Alexandria. Berosus, a Babylonian priest who would write the history of his land in Greek, would attribute the work explicitly to Nebuchadnezzar and his Median Persian wife, fixing forever the version that would travel through the centuries. And the biblical authors, when speaking of Babylon, even when condemning it for its pride, could not conceal the magnitude of what had been raised there. The prophet Daniel would describe the city as the golden kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. The book of Revelation would invoke it centuries later, still transfixed by the shadow of its greatness. By the rivers of Babylon, the psalmist wrote, the exiles sat down and wept as they remembered Zion. But the gardens, indifferent to the lament of others, continued to bloom above the heads of their captives. Queen Amitis lived the rest of her days walking among those terraces, tending, perhaps herself, to small seedlings growing in their own vessels, receiving at dusk the golden light that descended over the Euphrates and stained the tamarisk leaves copper, rediscovering, in each fragrance, each shadow, each drop of water falling in the fountains, fragments of the land she had left forever. The king would die in the year 562 before Christ, leaving the throne to fragile successors. Within a few decades, the Chaldean Empire crumbled. In the year 539 before Christ, the Persian Cyrus the Great entered Babylon virtually without battle, diverting the waters of the Euphrates to invade the city beneath its own walls. The great capital lost its independence, but the gardens continued living. Under the Persians, under the Macedonians of Alexander, they still existed. Alexander the Great, upon taking Babylon in the year 331 before Christ, contemplated them in person. He was astonished. He intended to make the city the capital of his new world empire. But fate would mock his plans. The Macedonian conqueror would die in Nebuchadnezzar's own palace in the year 323 before Christ, at only 32 years of age. Tradition holds that his last gaze drifted across the green terraces that seemed to float above the plain, as though the garden itself were bidding him farewell from the world. After Alexander, the city entered a slow decline. The canals silted up, irrigation failed. The Macedonian successors abandoned Babylon in favor of new capitals, Seleucia, Ctesiphon. The water stopped rising, the trees withered. The black earth of the terraces dried out and was carried away by the wind. The fired bricks, exposed to sun and the rare but pitiless rains, began dissolving into dust. Century by century, the hanging garden died in silence. When the Romans reached the region, they found only ruins. When the Arabs took Mesopotamia in the 7th century of our era, only mounds of clay remained, indistinguishable from the surrounding soil. When modern archaeologists began excavating Babylon in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, led by the German Robert Koldewey, nothing conclusive was found of the garden's foundations. And here arises the greatest mystery in the history of human architecture. Certain academic currents, led by the British scholar Stephanie Daly, have put forward in recent decades a provocative theory. The hanging gardens may never have stood in Babylon at all. They may have been built in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, under King Sennacherib, nearly a century before Nebuchadnezzar. Ancient accounts may have confused the two cities, and the name Babylon may have prevailed by virtue of its later fame. Other researchers defend the traditional location, pointing to anomalies in the excavations around the southern palace that could correspond to the foundations described by classical authors. Still others, more skeptical, maintain that the gardens never existed as described, that they were a product of the Greek imagination, a mythic composite assembled from the exaggerated accounts of travelers. The ultimate truth may never be known. The sands of Mesopotamia guard secrets that no century has been fully able to unearth, but something remains indestructible, crossing time. The idea that a man, possessing every army and every treasure in the known world, chose to use his power not to build another fortress, not to raise another temple to himself, but to return to a beloved woman a piece of her lost childhood. The idea that human engineering can, at its highest moments, serve not war, not vanity, not domination, but tenderness. The idea that even at the heart of the most powerful empire of antiquity, beneath the relentless sun of Mesopotamia, someone looked into the sad eyes of a queen and silently heard the name of distant mountains. The hanging gardens were not merely brick, bitumen, and lead. They were not merely transplanted trees and ascending fountains. They were the physical form of a longing. They were a reply in stone to a question of the soul. They were testimony that more than 2,500 years ago, in a city that is now desert, someone loved deeply enough to reverse the laws of gravity. And that is why the gardens are still alive, not in archaeological excavations, not in clay tablets broken by time, but in every moment when a human being, anywhere in the world, hears this story and feels, for an instant, the same thing Queen Amytis felt when the curtain fell. The certainty that even in a world of empires and deserts, it is still possible to build mountains and hear the wind move through the leaves.